I want to tell you about a forest that shouldn't exist. Not a forest that's old. Not a forest that's protected. Not a forest that scientists find remarkable because of its biodiversity or its carbon sequestration metrics or the particular way its root systems communicate underground. No, I want to tell you about a forest that shouldn't exist, because according to everything we've been taught about the history of human civilization, the kind of forest I'm describing was eradicated, systematically, worldwide, in a window of time so narrow, so precise, and so thoroughly undocumented that the more you look at it, the harder it becomes to accept the official explanation. And here's the thing. I wasn't looking for this. I wasn't a conspiracy theorist. I wasn't someone who spent weekends mapping ley lines or decoding 19th century colonial land surveys. I was looking at old botanical illustrations. That's it. Antique prints. The kind you find in estate sales, in the back rooms of university libraries, in the crumbling archives of institutions that have quietly stopped cataloguing their own collections. And in those illustrations made between roughly 1720 and 1870, I kept seeing the same thing. Over and over, across continents, across cultures, across what should have been entirely isolated civilizations with no conceivable connection to one another. I kept seeing food forests. Not farms, not gardens, not the neat organized row agriculture that we associate with pre-industrial civilization. Something else, something layered, something that looked, in illustration after illustration, like an intentional system. Trees that provided canopy, beneath them fruit-bearing shrubs, beneath those root vegetables, ground cover that suppressed weeds and fixed nitrogen, vines climbing the structural trees, bearing their own yields, water channels subtle, almost invisible in the drawings, threading through the whole system with what appeared to be deliberate design. And people, not labouring in those illustrations, not hunched over furrows, just present, moving through, harvesting. The deeper I looked, the more those illustrations began to feel less like historical curiosity and more like a record of something that was being ended. Let me give you specifics, because without specifics, this is just atmosphere. In 1843, a British surveyor named Trelawney Saunders compiled a report on forest resources in the Bengal region for the East India Company. The report is not widely cited, it's not taught in environmental history courses, but it's real, and it sits in the India Office records at the British Library, and what it describes is extraordinary. Saunders documented what he called compound forests, his words stretching across hundreds of square kilometres in regions that official history tells us were either sparsely populated or primarily grassland. These forests, he noted, appeared to be producing food, not incidentally, not as a side effect of natural abundance, producing food in patterns that he, an educated Victorian naturalist, could not attribute to coincidence. He estimated some of the trees in these systems were between 400 and 800 years old. The report was filed. Nothing was done with it. The forests were, within 2 decades, largely cleared for tea cultivation. Now, is that a single example? Yes. One colonial report, one surveyor, one region. You could dismiss it, but the pattern repeats. With unsettling precision, it repeats. In the Yucatan Peninsula, Spanish colonial records from the late 1500s, specifically the Relaciones Geográficas compiled between 1577 and 1585, under orders from King Philip II, describe Maya land use in terms that modern researchers have only recently begun to understand. The priests and administrators writing those reports didn't have the vocabulary for what they were seeing. They called it disordered forest. They called it jungle that the Indians have corrupted with their planting. What they were seeing, as contemporary ethno-ecologists have begun to argue, was probably one of the most sophisticated food production systems ever developed. Multi-story, multi-species, self-sustaining, producing yields across 12 months without any single season of preparation or rest. The Spanish proceeded to dismantle it, not accidentally. With policy, they called it reducción. the forced resettlement of indigenous populations into grid pattern towns, away from what they described as unhealthy forest dwelling. The food forests didn't survive the removal of the people who maintained them, or did they? Because here's where it gets interesting. Portions of the Yucatan, portions of Belize, portions of what is now southern Mexico, these areas remain to this day either privately restricted, actively discouraged for public access, or classified under land designations that prevent entry without permits that are, in practice, almost impossible to obtain. The official reason is biodiversity conservation. The official reason is the protection of archaeological sites. The official reason, depending on which agency you ask, changes. The deeper I went, the more I noticed that the official explanation keeps changing. That should tell us something. Let me take you somewhere else. Entirely. Northern Ethiopia, the highlands around Lalibela, a region most people know only because of its extraordinary rock-hewn churches, those impossible 12th century structures carved downward into volcanic rock, as if built by people who thought about architecture from the inside out. What most people don't know is what surrounds those churches, or rather, what surrounded them. Travellers in the 18th and early 19th century described the Lalibela Highlands as forested, dense, productive, layered forest. A Scottish explorer named James Bruce, who travelled through Abyssinia in the 1770s, wrote in his journals that were widely mocked on his return to Britain, incidentally, and dismissed as fantasy, of villages where the boundary between settlement and forest was essentially non-existent, where the forest provided food with, as he put it, a munificence that would embarrass any English farmer, where fruit trees of species he could not identify grew in what appeared to be organised proximity to medicinal plants, to water sources, to the specific microclimates that favoured particular yields. Today, the Lalibela Highlands are largely deforested. Erosion is severe. The soil that remains is thin and depleted. Orthodox Christian monasteries hold some of the last forest patches in the region, small sacred groves that survive only because they are considered holy ground, and have therefore been protected not by government policy, but by religious prohibition. But here is the question that I cannot stop asking. If the forest was there, if it was productive, if it was feeding people across what we now call one of the world's most food insecure regions, what happened to it, and when, and why? The official answer is population pressure and subsistence farming. The official answer is charcoal production and colonial timber extraction. And those things are real. Those things happened. I'm not dismissing the complexity of land use history in Ethiopia, but the timeline doesn't fully cooperate. The rate of clearing, the specificity of what was cleared and what was left, the timing relative to the arrival of certain administrative systems, all of it clusters in a window between roughly 1830 and 1890. A 60-year window. 60 years in which something that had existed for potentially thousands of years was dismantled with what appears, in retrospect, to be remarkable efficiency. Now travel with me to Borneo. The interior of Borneo, the regions now divided between Malaysian Sarawak, Indonesian Kalimantan, and the tiny nation of Brunei, contains some of the most heavily restricted forest on Earth. Not restricted because of military installations, not restricted because of mineral extraction. Restricted in significant portions under classifications that resist easy translation. Conservation zones that prohibit not just logging but entry. Indigenous land designations that function in practice as absolute barriers to outside researchers, and in some cases, areas so poorly mapped that their interiors are genuinely unknown to modern science. Researchers studying Dayak agricultural traditions have documented something that parallels what we saw in Bengal and the Yucatan. Systems called Tembawang, mixed agroforestry gardens that have been maintained, some of them for 300, 400, 500 years. These are not wild forests. They are not conventional farms. They are deliberately constructed ecological communities planted and managed across generations, producing food, medicine, building material and spiritual resources simultaneously. The older Timbawang, some researchers suggest, may predate the Dayak communities currently associated with them, may have been inherited rather than created, may represent the continuation of something begun by people whose identity and civilization have been effectively erased from the historical record. This raises a simple but critical question. If a food system can be inherited across cultures, across centuries, across the complete transformation of the civilizations that maintain it, what does that tell us about how old the original design might be? And that's where the 19th century becomes impossible to ignore. I want to be precise about this because the dates matter. The pattern I'm describing is not spread evenly across history. It is not a gradual erosion. It concentrates. Between approximately 1820 and 1880, across every continent where we have documentation, something happens to food forests specifically. Not forests generally, not woodlands, not timber-producing old-growth trees, which had their own complex and well-documented history of exploitation. No, the specific category of managed multi-story, multi-species, human-maintained food forests. The exact systems that would have made populations self-sufficient and independent of centralized food supply. These disappear in that 60-year window with a coordination that should be, statistically, impossible. Think about what coordination would actually require. We're talking about British colonial administrators in Bengal making land use decisions, Spanish and then Mexican authorities in the Yucatan making resettlement decisions, Ottoman administrators in what is now Lebanon and Syria implementing new land tenure systems that transformed managed cedar and food-producing forests into private timber estates. Dutch colonial officials in Java reclassifying community forest gardens as state property under the Domeinverklaring of 1870, which declared all land not proven to be privately owned to be government domain, effectively erasing with a single legal instrument thousands of years of community land management. Different empires, different continents, different languages, different stated justifications, same result, same window. The official explanation collapses here for me. The official explanation is that industrialization, worldwide trade, and the expansion of colonial agriculture created economic pressures that happened to affect forest systems simultaneously worldwide. And maybe that's true. Maybe it's all economics. Maybe the market pressure for cotton in Bengal and sugar in the Yucatan and timber in Borneo happened to coincide, and the food forests happened to be in the way, and the efficiency of 19th century colonial administration happened to produce world-spanning synchronized clearance without any coordination or shared purpose. Maybe, but I have a different question. What if the food forests weren't removed because they were in the way of something? What if they were removed because they were food forests? Because if you were trying to make a population dependent on centralized food supply, on purchased agricultural inputs, on the goodwill of administrators and merchants, and the complex machinery of industrial food production, a self-sustaining food forest would be the most dangerous thing in the world. It would be an act of political resistance simply to maintain one. Not because anyone declared it resistant, not because its practitioners were agitators or revolutionaries, but because a family or a community with a mature food forest simply doesn't need much. Doesn't need to buy seeds every year, doesn't need to buy fertilizer, doesn't need consistent cash income, doesn't need to participate in the market on the market's terms. A mature food forest tended across generations reduces dependency to an almost radical degree. And dependency, let me be careful here because I want to say this precisely. Dependency is a structural requirement of certain kinds of administrative power. You cannot extract tax from people who need nothing you control. You cannot compel labour from people whose food is already growing. You cannot manage, in the modern bureaucratic sense of that word, a population that is genuinely self-sufficient. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The removal of food forests in the 19th century was not only, or even primarily, an agricultural story. It was a story about the creation of need, about the manufacturing of dependency at a scale that required, apparently, world-spanning coordination of some kind. What that coordination was, who organised it, what the explicit understanding among administrators across disconnected empires might have been, I can't tell you. The documentation is, conveniently, sparse, but this is what we know. We know that in 1834 the British Parliament passed the Poor Law Amendment Act, which effectively ended outdoor relief for the able-bodied poor and forced them into workhouses. In the same decade, commons land across England, including many surviving managed food-producing forest commons, was being enclosed at an accelerating rate. The people who had maintained those commons, who had gathered food from them for centuries, found themselves simultaneously landless and legally required to work for wages. We know that the French colonial administration in West Africa, roughly between 1850 and 1900, systematically reclassified indigenous forest management systems as primitive agriculture and designated vast areas of managed food-producing forest as forêts classées, protected state forests from which local communities were excluded. Not to protect them, to control them, to create bureaucratic mechanisms that determined who could access what food-producing land and under what conditions. We know that in the American Midwest, the government subsidized transformation of the landscape from diverse prairie and food-producing edge habitat to monoculture grain production happened with extraordinary speed, a speed that required not just policy, but the active dismantling of existing systems. The Homestead Act of 1862 didn't just offer land, it required improvement of that land in specific ways that favoured row agriculture over any system that might be described as managed complexity. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Reclassify, restrict, replace with dependency, and yet. Not all of it was erased. This is the part that matters. There are places, specific, locatable, real places, where what I've been describing appears to have survived. Not obviously, not in ways that attract botanical tourism or feature in permaculture textbooks, in ways that are specifically and consistently hard to access. The forests around Socotra Island, off the Horn of Africa, contain species, the dragonblood tree, the desert rose, the cucumber tree, that exist nowhere else on Earth. The island has been restricted in various ways for most of modern history, first under the British Protectorate, then under the Sultanate, then under Soviet military use, then under various Yemeni administrations. The specific combination of accessibility barriers has meant that Socotra's interior remains among the least studied inhabited areas on the planet. Researchers who have gained access describe what appears to be a living repository, plants with food and medicinal properties unlike anything in the established taxonomic literature, growing in arrangements that some have cautiously described as non-random. Non-random. In a remote island ecosystem that should, by every conventional model, be too stressed to support deliberate arrangement. The Valdivian temperate rainforest of Chile and Argentina, one of only 5 temperate rainforest regions on Earth, contains trees that predate the oldest dates assigned to complex civilization in South America by centuries. The monkey puzzle tree, Araucaria araucanae, produces seeds that served as a dietary staple for indigenous Pehuenche people for time periods that oral tradition extends into what academic history considers prehistory. The forests are now partially protected, partially private, and in some areas accessible only through a permitting system that appears, to researchers who have tried it, to be designed to discourage rather than enable study. The sacred forests of India, Sarais, Devaravanas, Orans, are a different kind of survival. These are forest patches maintained not by government policy but by religious community authority. Hundreds of them scattered across Rajasthan, Karnataka, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu. Some of them contain species that have disappeared from every other forest in the region. Some of them are old enough that their origins predate the communities currently responsible for their protection. No one is quite sure who planted them, or when, or why the specific species within them were chosen. The silence from academic institutions on these sacred groves has been, I would say, deafening. You'd expect, if we were genuinely interested in understanding pre-modern food systems, that sacred groves would be among the most studied ecosystems on Earth. Instead, they are among the least. There are estimates that India alone contains tens of thousands of such groves. The comprehensive botanical survey of even the most significant among them has never been conducted. Why? That is not a rhetorical question. I genuinely cannot find a satisfying institutional answer to why the most potentially revealing living archives of pre-modern ecology remain in 2024 essentially unsurveyed. The evidence suggests something much larger when you start looking not at what's documented, but at what isn't. History is, among other things, a record of what people chose to write down, and what they chose to preserve, and what they chose to translate, and what they chose to fund the archiving of. When I started looking at the documentary record of food forests specifically, not forests generally, but the managed multi-story, deliberately designed systems, I found something that surprised me more than any of the specific examples I've mentioned. The gap. There is extensive botanical literature on timber trees in the colonial period. There is extensive literature on cash crop cultivation. There is literature on ornamental gardens, on medicinal plant collections, on the great taxonomic expeditions that gathered, classified, and named the world's plant species with extraordinary thoroughness. The 19th century was, by any measure, a period of intense botanical documentation. But the food forests themselves, the systems that, as we've seen, clearly existed across multiple continents and clearly fed significant populations, are almost absent from that literature. Not underrepresented, almost absent. You'll find them in the margins, in the asides of travellers' journals, in the background of illustrations whose primary subject is something else, a colonial building, a converted landscape, a new road cutting through what the illustrator apparently thought was simply jungle. You'll find them in the indigenous oral traditions that were largely not transcribed until the 20th century, and then only in fragments, and then often by researchers whose institutional frameworks were not designed to understand what they were being told. The official explanation for this absence is that food forests weren't considered scientifically interesting by 19th century standards, which privileged classification over ecology and timber species over food species. And that's partially true, but here's the strangest part. When I look at what 19th century botanists did write about, when they noted these systems at all, the language they use is almost uniformly dismissive, disordered, primitive, unimproved, chaotic. Words that carry embedded in them a specific and consistent value judgment, that these systems were not the products of intelligence and design, but the products of accident or ignorance. That judgment, made consistently across cultures, across language barriers by educated men who were otherwise perfectly capable of recognizing design when they saw it, that judgment seems retrospectively motivated. Not by curiosity, not by the honest assessment of evidence, by something else. Not discovery, not documentation, not the advancement of knowledge, but replacement. Replacement with systems that could be owned, taxed, managed and made to produce dependency rather than abundance. And here's where I want to pause on the knowledge itself, because the food forest is not simply an agricultural technique. The deeper I went into the pre-modern literature, the manuscripts that predate the 19th century rupture, the texts that survived in religious libraries and private collections, and the occasionally overlooked archives of institutions that don't fully understand what they hold, the more a specific understanding began to emerge. The people who maintain these systems understood something about ecology that contemporary science has only formally articulated in the last 50 years. They understood that a forest is not a collection of trees. It is a community, a network, a system of mutual dependency and mutual support in which each component, each tree, each shrub, each ground cover plant, each fungal network beneath the soil is both a beneficiary and a contributor to the whole. They understood empirically what we now call mycorrhizal networks. They understood what we now call nitrogen fixation. They understood companion planting not as folk wisdom, but as a sophisticated ecological technology refined over generations of observation. And crucially, they understood that a food forest once established sustains itself, that the primary labour is not maintenance but design, that you plant it, you tend it through its establishment, and then you harvest from it for generations with minimal external input. This is not a small thing. This is potentially the most important agricultural insight in human history. The idea that food production does not require annual labour at the scale demanded by row agriculture, that it does not require purchased inputs, that it does not require the kind of organised, coordinated, seasonally intense work that has, across most of recorded history, made agricultural populations susceptible to exactly the kind of administrative control that produces empires and tax systems and standing armies. A population that can feed itself from a food forest is a population that is very difficult to conscript, very difficult to tax into poverty, very difficult to move, very difficult to manage, in the particular sense that administrators have always meant that word. This raises a simple but critical question. Is it possible that what was erased in the 19th century was not just a set of agricultural practices, but a specific form of human freedom? I want to return to where I started. The forest that shouldn't exist. There are persistent, I want to be careful with this word, persistent accounts, not in fringe literature, but in the footnotes of botanical surveys, in the asides of ecological researchers, in the oral traditions of communities that have maintained contact with certain restricted areas of forest systems that continue to function. Not as remnants, not as degraded fragments of something that was once larger, as functioning, producing, living food forests. In the interior of Papua New Guinea, where a combination of terrain, cultural resistance and residual land sovereignty has made certain areas effectively inaccessible to outside researchers. There are communities that appear to maintain food systems of extraordinary complexity and productivity. Systems that outside researchers, when they have been permitted brief access, have described with a mixture of scientific excitement and institutional caution that suggests they understand the implications of what they're seeing. In the highlands of Vietnam and Laos, in areas still affected by unexploded ordnance from the American War, which creates its own perverse form of conservation by making vast areas genuinely too dangerous to clear, forest systems of unknown age persist. The ordnance will not be cleared for decades, possibly for a century. Whatever is inside those forests will remain inaccessible to researchers and to clearance operations alike for that entire period. In the Amazon basin, new research published in the last decade has continued to reveal that what we call the Amazon rainforest is, in significant portions, not wild at all. It is managed. It is the product of deliberate planting decisions made by civilizations whose names we don't know, whose social structures we can barely infer, and whose collapse, sudden, total, and still not fully explained, left behind a living infrastructure that continues to function, continues to produce, continues to be harvested by communities who inherited it without fully understanding its origins. The Amazon itself, in other words, may be the world's largest food forest. And it may have been designed. By whom? When? Under what social organization? And with what understanding of ecology? We don't know. We genuinely don't know. And the evidence suggests that this gap in our knowledge is not entirely natural, that there are documents and surveys and reports and illustrations sitting in archives, misfiled, untranslated or quietly unfunded in their digitization, that would begin to fill that gap. If someone chose to look, I've spent a significant portion of my adult life, in some sense, looking. And I want to be honest with you about what I've found and what I haven't. I haven't found a smoking document. I haven't found the colonial memo that says, destroy the food forests because they prevent dependency. I haven't found the coordinating institution, the shared policy, the network of administrators who consciously and explicitly agreed to transform the food systems of the entire planet within a 60-year window. What I've found is the shape of that thing, the shadow of it, the way that independent decisions made in languages that couldn't communicate with one another by institutions with conflicting interests and competing imperial ambitions produced outcomes so similar that the similarity itself becomes a kind of evidence. Not evidence of what happened, evidence that something happened. The deeper I went, the more the official history of the 19th century began to look not like a record of progress and improvement, not like the story of science and rationality replacing superstition and inefficiency, but like the story of a replacement, of something old and functional and deeply, deeply human being exchanged, not always voluntarily, not always violently, but consistently, worldwide, efficiently, for something that required more, produced more dependency, and left less room for the kind of quiet, rooted, generational self-sufficiency that food forests represent. And the places where the old thing survives, the sacred groves, the restricted interiors, the areas made inaccessible by terrain or ordnance or bureaucratic friction, or the particular slowness of institutions that don't fully know what they're protecting. These places feel, to me, less like conservation areas and more like archives of a way of knowing, a way of living with land rather than on it, a technology of patience and design and multi-generational thinking that assumes, as its first premise, that the forest is not a resource to be extracted, but a relationship to be maintained. We called that primitive. We called it disordered. We cleared it. And now, in the 21st century, as we look with increasing urgency for sustainable food systems as we fund research into mycorrhizal networks and companion planting and agroforestry and the ecology of managed woodlands, we are discovering, with the astonishment of people finding a library they didn't know existed, that everything we're looking for was already known, was already practiced, was already growing, and that the question is not how to invent a sustainable food system. The question is, who decided to end the one we had, and whether the last of it, hidden in restricted interiors, protected by sacred prohibition, surviving in the margins of maps that stop where the terrain becomes inconvenient, whether that last living remnant carries enough of the original knowledge to answer that question, or whether the answer, like the forests themselves, is something we will only recognize after we've lost the last of it. That's the thing about forests. They take centuries to grow, and they can be cleared in a season.